I'm Denny Taylor, and I'm here with Geoff Ward to speak with him about his new fantasy novel, You're Not Dead. The US launch will take place this evening at the Mysterious Bookstore in Greenwich Village. Geoff, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start by talking about fantasy, and perhaps my first question would be, have you been interested in fantasy all your life?
Yes is the answer, both for literary and quite unliterary reasons. So, very early on when I was learning to read, when I was reading children's books, the baker gave me a book, loaned me a book, and it was a German set of fairy tales, Struwwelpeter in English. But whereas I'd read fairy tales that were quite gentle and dreamy, these are terrible things about a little girl who burns a house down and dies and so on. So I began to pick up that there was dark fantasy and not just pleasurable, light reading very early on in my reading career. On top of that was the rather strange home situation. I mean, it was a very perfectly normal home situation with a mum and dad and me. But there were one or two aspects that I think planted seeds of the fantastic in me. One was the fact that my father, who was a head teacher, that was his day job, but was an evangelical minister also. And although I couldn't quite work out what was going on, it subsequently turned out that he was more and more involving himself in things like exorcisms. Meanwhile, though, next door was another man with a day job of a very ordinary sort, and Mr. Wright worked for the Cooperative Insurance Society in Manchester. But in his spare time, he was a magician. So I would go around there and he'd just do tricks. The neighbour would do tricks. Peacock cards would be fanned in front of me, a coin produced from behind my ear. And I loved all this stuff, but I think also I was responding to the fact that you can go in one narrow terraced house and be in that world, and you can go in the next door house, which has similar looking people in it, and you are a world away. So I think fantasy was seeded even before I read Poe and Lovecraft and the other writers that I did read, and I was a precocious, bookish child. I was hideously bookish and cocooned in some ways. So fantasy was also my modus operandi, because basically I didn't get out much. So I was reading Poe and Lovecraft and so on by the age of 7 or so, and that was all going in there. So it really does go back with me a very long way, and there's certainly it isn't going away.
And that's what prompted you to write You're Not Dead?
It's what prompted me to read, and then I've had a career in which I've written many other books and sorts of books, non-fiction, literary criticism, literary history, and poetry. But I came to fiction relatively late, and what led me to write You're Not Dead, in a literal sense, was that I spent the new year of 2009 in Death Valley, California, which blew me away. I just didn't realise at the time how much and how far it had blown me away. So when we got back to LA and then London, I just wanted to write something, just to capture something about this extraordinary place before it faded and warped in my mind and was gone, like the dunes themselves in Death Valley, which constantly change shape. You look behind you and the sand is not the shape that it was, so you have to be very careful about getting lost. Never go anywhere alone. A strange place, but very, very powerful, and I just wanted to capture something of that power. But when I did start writing about Death Valley, I realised I was not writing in what you might call diary mode. I was writing in a rather heightened prose, which was becoming fiction as I went along. And sure enough, soon the desert, my desert, was peopled with characters walking towards me, falling out or falling in love with each other. And I thought, oh, I'm writing fiction. I still wasn't sure I was writing a novel. I thought this could be a short story or a long short story. I'm just going to go with this. And in fact, through the writing of the whole book in its first draft form, I felt very superstitious. I couldn't read other writers for fear that their work would get into mine. And I felt almost I was carrying something, balancing it, that if I just stopped and made the wrong move mentally, I might drop and it might smash. I might never finish this.
You might lose it.
I might lose it. So the whole process was superstitious, very, very hyper alert, but also literally not knowing where I was going. I would not know how I was going to finish any given chapter. I got a rough idea of how things were going to end, because there is this motif of the book, Miles's book, the book within my book. He's on a quest to find this rare, extremely rare, late Victorian treatise, which claims not only to be about magic and how to perform acts of real magic, but does itself start to behave in magical ways. The words change every time he reads them. So I had an idea about how that book within a book motif would end, but the rest was a tightrope walk into the mist. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I was going, and this was great.
I find myself holding my breath as you're talking in case the book changes as we're talking.
It has a
about
life
it.
of its own. Also, I didn't know how long it should be. I thought perhaps 70,000 words, which I suppose has always been my idea of what an academic book should take up in terms of age, print. So I phoned Adam Roberts, a sci-fi writer, and I said, Adam, how long is a novel? And he immediately got what I meant. And he said, no, you've got to go over the 90, make it 100 if you can. So I thought, great, a subplot, here we go. So I just carried on. But again, there was still this mysterious feeling that magic was not only the theme of the book, but had come into my life in some way, into the process itself. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantasy is currently a diverse phenomenon, including work as varied as and disparate as Netflix series like Stranger Things and Jessica Jones, graphic novels as well as the fiction of Tim Powers, not to mention the Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
Where does your novel fit in relationship to all of this?
It's got a closer relationship to some of those than to others. I loved Stranger Things, though that's much closer to Stephen King's world than it is to mine. Apparently King binge-watched it and thought it was the greatest thing he'd never written. It was his greatest hits, but he hadn't written it. I loved it, though. I thought it was terrific. Of the other things you mention, Tim Powers I relate to, I think, quite closely, maybe more than any other current writer of fiction, because he writes of absolutely extraordinary, impossible events and people vanishing into different zones of time and space. But he's doing it for a purpose. So his latest book, which I've just read, Medusa's Web, impossible things happen, contact with the beyond, all kinds of things. The past erupts into the present. But it allows him to do something else, which is effectively a secret history of Los Angeles. Now, that's not the kind of thing I do. I'm not about to write a secret history of Los Angeles, I don't think. But fantasy, for me, is a way of cutting to the chase. It's not actually an escape from reality at all. It's my way of getting to the things in reality and the themes that I want to get to very fast. Because if you can walk through a mirror, as Miles and Becky can, if you can have telepathy, if you can contact someone in dreams and have a shared dream, as they do, if you can, as Miles does, step into a photograph, he can't always get back, of course, but he can step into them, then you're actually literally providing yourself with portals through which you can move your characters and the reader's mind at speed and get to where you really want to be, which is themes of memory, of who we are, of that strange disconnect when you look into the mirror, that the face that looks back is yours, but also somehow isn't quite. The fact that what we often have most in common is the dark side of the same interior stars. The things we don't know about ourselves are quite possibly the things we have most in common with our neighbour. So our neighbour is both in another world mentally, and yet we're in the same one, but we don't know ourselves. It's these paradoxes that I want to get to, in a non-philosophical, vivid way, through people living them out. And fantasy is my way of jet-setting there, as fast as I can.
In demonstrations that the reader can relate to and find themselves in similar situations. That to me is so extraordinary about your novel, is the connections that readers can make within the sphere that you're just talking about.
Yes, I tried, particularly with this first novel, when I rewrote it, knowing by now that it was going to be a trilogy. So when I rewrote it, I bore that in mind. And I thought, in this first one, try and appeal to as wide an age range as you can. It should appeal to young people. I'm aware that further down in the trilogy, Miles will, by definition, be older. So going back to those things you mentioned on Netflix, which is a great dark theatre for fantasy at the moment, Jessica Jones is likely to appeal most to adolescent girls. As it happens, I love it. It appeals to my inner adolescent girl. I think it's great. But you do get things that will appeal to certain age ranges within the fantasy genre. Game of Thrones has a wide appeal, but I'm not doing Game of Thrones type fantasy. I don't particularly respond well to swords and sorcery and dwarves and damsels in medieval somewhere. That's not really my kind of fantasy. In fact, my fantasy, although it is definitely fantasy, relies on the modern and the everyday very much. On everyday things like telephones, books, cars, but something strange has happened. That's the journey I take.
But not cell phones.
But not cell phones, because of course they haven't been invented yet in my world, or Miles's world.
Your day job is master of, at Cambridge College, and we think of you as the first head of the house who has written horror or fantasy since M.R. James. That's I think is correct. He wrote his ghost stories while provost at King's.
He did, and at Eton, but he was at King's College, Cambridge for a long time as provost.
So
I do appear to be the first one since. Yeah.
That situates you in a deeply and classically British place.
Yes.
In your fiction, British fantasy specifically, some of it is set in Los Angeles, Death
Yeah.
Valley, and New York.
Yes.
Could you tell us about your psychic geography?
Yes. Places are very, very important to me. I read novels, even classic novels, like, say, George Eliot's Middlemarch, and I'm frustrated when I read, because I can hear the characters discussing ethics, relationships, society, but I can't see the place. She just doesn't do much description, and I feel thwarted, because I feel one of the things that we can get from a novel is not just voices and people moving around doing things, but the places in which they do them being profoundly important. The extraordinary differences and distinctiveness of London vis-à-vis Los Angeles, vis-à-vis Death Valley or New York. So this first novel is set in London, Death Valley, LA, New York and Cairo, all places I've been with very, very powerful identities as cities. And that's very important to me, partly because it's ballast. If I didn't have that ballast of place and of having to get it right, which I hope I do, that earths me in a way. It kind of brings me down, whereas a lot of the other aspects of my writing, if they were left without that to float free, would float rather giddily up and away into poetic or philosophical speculation.